It doesn't start with a bang, it starts with a quiet shift, a change in the numbers, the money, the mood. Suddenly, people stop spending, prices jump, trust disappears, and then one day, the government makes a desperate move. That moment just happened in Russia. Out of nowhere, a new law, a hidden tax, a digital currency rollout, and millions of Russians realized the system isn't helping them survive. It's making sure they can't escape. This is what collapse looks like at the start. Not tanks in the streets, but a regime clawing into wallets, locking digital doors, and hoping no one notices the foundation cracking beneath their feet. But we noticed, and if history is right, this is just the beginning. Let's break it all down. For years, Russia lived off a simple formula: pump oil, sell gas. Watch the money roll in. That revenue paid for everything: roads, schools, hospitals, pensions, and the endless political promises that kept the system running smoothly. As long as energy prices stayed high, the machine worked. Putin could fund wars, buy loyalty, and project power across the globe. Russia was an energy superpower, and the world depended on its exports. But that golden tap, it just ran dry. In November 2025, Russia's oil export revenues hit their lowest point since the invasion of Ukraine began. The International Energy Agency confirmed it, just under $11 billion for the month. That's $3.5 billion less than the same month last year. And this wasn't a one-time dip. Oil and gas revenues dropped 22% across the first 9 months of 2025. The Russian Finance Ministry admitted it themselves. What happened? A perfect storm of pressure that Moscow never saw coming. Ukrainian drone strikes gutted Black Sea export routes. Seaborne shipments through that corridor collapsed by 42% in a single month. Refineries that once processed crude for export sat damaged or destroyed. Western sanctions tightened around Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's two biggest oil producers. Buyers started backing away, scared of secondary sanctions that could lock them out of Western financial systems entirely. And the price of Urals crude, the benchmark for Russian oil, plunged to just $43 a barrel. For context, Russia's 2025 budget was built on the assumption of $70 oil. The math doesn't work anymore. Moscow still sells, of course, but only to buyers willing to take advantage of its desperation. China and India now dictate the discounts, the delivery routes, even the currency of payment. Russian oil that once commanded top dollar now gets shipped east at $30 to $40 below global prices, just to keep some cash flowing. What was once a proud energy empire has quietly become a supplier on Beijing's terms, and the relationship isn't equal. As Moscow leans harder on China to buy its crude, it surrenders leverage with every shipment. Beijing sets the terms. Russia accepts them, because what choice does it have? The oil still flows, but the profits have shrunk dramatically. And while the pipelines pump less money into Moscow's coffers, the war keeps demanding more, much more. Here's what Moscow doesn't want you to know. The money that's still coming in, it's not even close to covering what's going out. Russia's 2025 defense budget hit 13.5 trillion rubles, roughly $145 billion. That's 6.3% of GDP, a 25% jump from the previous year, the largest military budget since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for the first time in Vladimir Putin's entire tenure, pure military spending now exceeds what Russia spends on health, education, and social services combined. Let that sink in. Every ruble going to missiles, tanks, and soldiers' paychecks is a ruble not going to hospitals, schools, or pensions. Every shell fired at Ukraine levels a hole in the budget back home. Maternity wards fall apart in regional cities. Dialysis machines run on borrowed time in provincial hospitals. Roads crumble while rockets fly, and the people paying the price never voted for any of it. The budget was supposed to be balanced. The finance ministry projected a deficit of just 0.5% of GDP at the start of the year, a manageable gap of about 1.2 trillion rubles. Officials boasted about fiscal discipline. They promised stability. They said Russia had adapted to sanctions. But by June, that projection had already been blown apart. The revised deficits? 3.8 trillion rubles. That's 1.7% of GDP, more than 3 times the original target. And here's the part that should alarm anyone watching closely. In the first 5 months of 2025 alone, Russia's budget deficit hit 3.4 trillion rubles. That's nearly 90% of the full-year target, burned through before summer even started. The government was supposed to run deficits in a controlled way. Instead, it's hemorrhaging money at a rate that makes the original budget look like fantasy. The Kremlin tried to hide the scale of the damage. Military spending got buried inside vague budget lines labeled national projects and infrastructure initiatives. Funds for missiles got recorded as construction support. Contracts for ammunition disappeared into line items for regional development. On paper, the numbers look manageable. In reality, it's a shell game, and even officials inside the finance ministry know the math no longer adds up. The goal isn't accuracy anymore, it's survival. So, where does the Kremlin turn when the oil money dries up and the war keeps demanding more? The answer is brutally simple. It turns on its own people. At first, the changes sounded harmless enough. Officials called them budget adjustments, a soft phrase that really meant we're taking more of your money. Corporate tax jumped from 20 to 25%, the first major increase in over a decade. The government dressed it up as patriotism, urging big companies to support the special military operation. State television ran segments about corporate responsibility, about duty, about sacrifice for the motherland. But here's what they didn't show. The state giants, Gazprom, Rosneft, Burbank, quietly received exemptions, extensions, and creative loopholes to soften the blow. Within weeks of the announcement, the companies with the closest Kremlin connections had found their escape routes. Ownership structures shifted through proxies. Profits moved to friendlier jurisdictions like Dubai, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. All perfectly legal, all perfectly revealing. The real burden fell on the small guys, family cafes trying to survive in regional cities, repair shops running on thin margins, delivery firms competing against state-backed logistics companies. They couldn't lobby their way out. They couldn't hide their profits offshore. They just paid and bled. And it's about to get worse. Starting January 2026, Russia's value-added tax rises from 20 to 22%, despite earlier government promises not to touch taxes until 2030. The finance ministry announced it quietly, buried in budget documents, hoping no one would notice. That single change is expected to extract another trillion rubles from the economy. But the pain doesn't stop there. The threshold for requiring businesses to collect VAT dropped to just 10 million rubles in annual sales, about $123,000. Small businesses that never had to deal with this burden before are now caught in the net. One Moscow pensioner put it bluntly to reporters. Small and medium businesses will fold, and the budget will get less, not more. For ordinary Russian citizens, the squeeze is everywhere. Utility tariffs jumped 12% in 2025, well above inflation. Vehicle recycling fees exploded. A car registration that used to cost a few thousand rubles now runs into the hundreds of thousands for anything with decent horsepower. Electricity and gas prices climbed even as Russia sold the same energy abroad at steep discounts. Pensioners interviewed in Moscow spoke of splitting pills to make prescriptions last, of choosing between heating and food, of watching savings evaporate month by month. Russia's small business index fell to a 2-year low. Nearly half of all companies reported revenue losses. Retail sales plunged 8%, wiping billions from the economy. Business closures reached a 5-year high, and banks rejected 4 out of 5 loan applications because every spare ruble was being funneled somewhere else. The so-called temporary war surcharges quietly became permanent. The patriotic duties turned into permanent extractions, and the people paying the price, they never signed up for any of it. And yet, what's happening in bank accounts right now is even more dangerous, because the Kremlin isn't just taxing Russians anymore. It's gambling with their savings. Russia's financial system has quietly become the government's life support machine. State banks like Sberbank and VTB have been transformed into piggy banks for the Kremlin's deficit. They're buying up massive amounts of government bonds, known as OFZs, because no one else will. Before the war, foreign investors held a significant chunk of Russian government debt. That money is gone now. Sanctions locked it out. Foreign ownership of Russian bonds has collapsed by nearly 70% since January 2022. What remains is a domestic market where state-controlled banks buy bonds from the state-controlled government, creating a closed loop that looks stable on paper but masks a deeper dysfunction. These bonds used to be safe investments. Now they're a lifeline for a government running out of options. And every ruble the state borrows pushes out the private sector. Small businesses that need loans to grow or simply survive are finding the cupboards empty. Every spare ruble is being funneled into the war effort. The finance ministry borrowed nearly 3 trillion rubles in the first half of 2025 through domestic bond issuances alone. Interest rates on those bonds have climbed from 10.6% to nearly 12%. Meanwhile, the central bank holds its key rate at 16.5%, crushing any hope of private investment or economic expansion. But here's the trap that makes it all worse. The more the government spends on inflated military contracts, the more inflation rises. Defense contractors build triple what things cost before the war. Factories that once built civilian machinery now churn out military equipment at massively inflated prices, billing the state for every screw and circuit. The government pays inflated prices, raises taxes to cover the extra spending, which drives up costs again. The central bank raises rates to fight inflation. Higher rates strangle private business. Struggling businesses pay less tax. Lower tax revenue forces the government to borrow more. And the cycle repeats. A closed loop of self-destruction. An engine that burns its own fuel. But the most chilling part of Moscow's plan hasn't even been fully activated yet. What comes next will track every ruble in every wallet. And there's nothing Russians can do to stop it. The digital ruble, Russia's state-backed electronic currency. Officially, it's being sold as innovation, a modern way to make payments faster and safer. The Bank of Russia talks about convenience, about efficiency, about bringing the payment system into the 21st century. In reality, it's something much simpler. Control. Every transaction is trackable, every purchase traceable, every tax automatically extracted before you even see the money. Once the digital ruble rolls out fully, the state won't need to ask for payment. It won't need to send a tax bill. It can just help itself, right from your phone while you sleep. The system gives officials the power to freeze funds instantly, restrict spending categories, limit what certain groups can buy. Dissent too loudly? Your digital wallet could lock. Owe back taxes? The state takes its cut before your paycheck lands. Fall out of favor with local authorities? Good luck buying a train ticket out of town. The programmable nature of the currency means the government can decide not just how much you have, but what you're allowed to spend it on. The line between patriotism and punishment vanishes completely. The rollout was supposed to begin in July 2025, but technical delays and political friction with banks reluctant to surrender their own profits pushed it back to September 2026. By that date, all major banks and any retailer earning more than 120 million rubles annually will be required to accept digital ruble payments. By 2027, the threshold drops further. By 2028, nearly every business in Russia will be plugged into the grid. Right now, the pilot program includes just 15 banks, around 2,000 individuals, and 50-odd companies. A test run, a proof of concept, Moscow calls it voluntary. The Bank of Russia insists personal use will remain optional. But once the infrastructure is in place, opting out won't be an option. That voluntary phase is just the warm-up. And anyone who watches how authoritarian systems evolve knows what comes next. And the Kremlin's desperation doesn't stop at digital wallets. To keep the war machine running, Moscow is now selling something it swore it would never touch. Russia's National Wealth Fund was supposed to be the country's financial cushion, a rainy day reserve built over decades from oil and gas profits. Before the war, it held over $130 billion in liquid assets, enough to weather sanctions, enough to project strength, enough to outlast Western pressure for years. Putin pointed to it as proof of Russia's resilience. That cushion has been gutted. By May 2025, liquid assets in the fund had collapsed to just $35 billion, a two-thirds decline in 3 years of war. Economists at the Russian Presidential Academy warned the fund could be completely exhausted by late 2026 if current trends continue. The central bank's own worst-case scenario suggests it could happen even sooner, potentially by the end of 2025 if oil prices stay low. The head of the central bank herself admitted at a recent forum that many of the country's financial buffers have been used up, and when the domestic reserves start running thin, Moscow looked abroad to assets it once boasted it would develop with Russian technology alone. Beneath the Arctic ice lies Russia's last untapped oil frontier. Vast reserves along the continental shelf, billions of barrels already mapped. For years, the Kremlin promised these would be the crown jewel of energy sovereignty. Proof of Russian ingenuity developed with homegrown icebreakers and rigs. But sanctions crippled the joint ventures needed to drill in 40 below temperatures. Equipment froze in place. Spare parts never arrived. And rather than wait years for solutions, Moscow did the unthinkable. It auctioned exploration licenses to Chinese state companies in exchange for immediate cash. Beijing now holds a sizable share of every future barrel. Veto power over export routes, control over how profits get split. What was meant to be Russia's future became the Kremlin's fastest ATM. Every barrel sold today is a barrel Russia will never tax tomorrow. Selling the future to pay for the present. That's just another tax. One paid by generations who haven't even been born yet. And here's where the collapse pattern becomes unmistakable. Because what's happening to Russia's workforce right now? We've seen this exact thing before. Right before the Soviet Union fell. More than 650 Russians have left the country since 2022 and haven't come back. That's according to research from Outrush, which tracked immigration patterns through 2024. Only about 8% of those who left have returned. The rest? Building new lives in Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Serbia, Argentina, anywhere that would take them. These aren't random departures. 43% of immigrants work in tech. Another 21% come from arts, culture, science, and media. Engineers, doctors, programmers, entrepreneurs. The people any modern economy needs to function. Gone! And with them, the human capital that takes generations to rebuild. Russian employers are already struggling to fill vacancies in IT, finance, biotechnology, and medicine. Companies have been forced to lower job requirements just to get bodies through the door. And thanks to sanctions, importing skilled workers from abroad isn't an option either. The result is a labor crisis that's reshaping the entire country. Factories are short on welders. Farms can't find workers. Trucking companies are desperate for drivers. Wages have been driven up by shortage, which drives inflation higher, which forces the central bank to keep rates elevated, which crushes the businesses trying to pay those wages. Another self-reinforcing trap. Women have stepped into the roles that men once filled, running repair shops, managing transport fleets, keeping farms operational. It's a quiet revolution born of necessity, but it comes at a brutal cost. The burden of work, childcare, and household management has fallen harder than ever before on women, especially in smaller towns where support systems barely exist. Birth rates are dropping, healthcare costs are rising, entire regions are aging faster than ever before. Fewer young people means fewer future taxpayers, which means the state's already shrinking tax base will only get smaller just as demands on it grow. The war is fought abroad, but its demographic damage unfolds at home, and that damage will last decades longer than any ceasefire. But here's the part that should terrify the Kremlin. It's not the people who are leaving that pose the biggest threat. It's the people who stayed and stopped believing. Frustration is quietly spilling into something else entirely, the gray economy. An estimated 15 to 20% of Russian GDP now moves through unofficial channels. Millions of Russians work off the books as tutors, handymen, small-time online sellers. Some have created entire ghost companies to avoid taxes altogether. Barter systems have returned in some regions. Underground markets for imported goods flourish in cities that officially don't have access to Western products. The state knows it's happening, but cracking down would just drive what's left of the economy further underground. So officials look the other way, collecting what they can, pretending the rest doesn't exist. And the real crisis isn't just economic, it's psychological. People have stopped believing the system will ever play fair. They've watched every temporary tax become permanent, every patriotic duty turn into another bill, every promise of a war dividend evaporate into higher prices and empty shelves. They know the war won't end soon, which means the taxes won't either. When trust in the state collapses, people simply start building lives outside of it. Not through protest, through quiet withdrawal. One side hustle at a time, one workaround at a time, one tax dodged at a time, one relationship with local officials greased to avoid scrutiny. That's the real danger for the Kremlin, not angry crowds in the streets, but millions of Russians learning to live without their government. And once that happens, no amount of new taxes can ever fill the hole left behind. That pattern? Historians recognize it immediately. It's what happened in the final years of the Soviet Union. Outwardly, everyone played along. They paid what they had to pay, repeated the right slogans, pretended the system still worked. But in private, they laughed at it, cheated it, or ignored it entirely. The cynicism spread faster than any protest ever could. When no one believes the rules mean anything, corruption becomes a coping mechanism, not a crime. Initiative dies. Why start a business when it'll be taxed to the ground and seized by someone better connected? Why innovate when success just paints a target on your back? An economy can survive sanctions. It can survive inflation. It can even survive war for a while. But it cannot survive a population that stops believing effort matters. That is the silent collapse the numbers never show. So, what happens next? The playbook is already written. Taxes will go unpaid. Bills will pile up. Small businesses will shut their doors. The gray economy will grow. And at some point, the government may take extreme measures. Bank accounts frozen, assets seized, withdrawal limits imposed, citizens forced to buy government bonds whether they want to or not. These steps might bring in cash for a short while, but they'll make the long-term crisis worse. Every attempt to stabilize the budget risks destabilizing the people. The real battlefield is no longer in Ukraine. It's in the kitchens, the wallets, and the bank accounts across Russia. The war economy still runs, but every day pushes the country closer to a breaking point, financially, socially, politically. Russia won't collapse overnight, but the warning signs are impossible to ignore. Inflation expectations among Russians have jumped to their highest level in a year. Households believe prices are rising far faster than official figures suggest. Capital is fleeing through whatever channels remain open. The brain drain is accelerating. And the harder the government squeezes, the weaker society becomes. The gap between propaganda and reality is widening. Sooner or later, that gap becomes too wide to close. This is what collapse looks like before it happens. Not with a bang, with a slow drain, a quiet withdrawal, a system feeding on itself until there's nothing left to take. So, what do you think? Is Russia heading for a breaking point? Or can the Kremlin hold it together longer than anyone expects? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of what's really happening in the world, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We're just getting started.